Hi, welcome to Motif Strategy Overview. This video is made for people who are curious to get a better sense of how to strategically play this game. If you haven't already, I would recommend going through the introduction video explaining the basic rules of the game before continuing. In this video, we will explore 10 different tactics that will help you become a better Motif player. Let's get started. The first tactic we'll introduce is called traps. Let's take a look at a game that's just starting and see how a trap can take place. In this example, Black just finished positioning their 2 pawns to the bottom corner of the board. It's Gold's turn, and they have the possibility to trap Black. To do this, they must surround Black's pawns to prevent them from moving. So, Gold can place one of their pawns here, the other pawn that's already on the board here, and finally add their third new pawn here to surround the Black's pawns. Notice how both of the Black's pawns can't move on the next turn. In this specific situation, Gold wins. Why? Because Black can't move, add a new pawn to the board, or flip any of their squares on the board. So when you surround pawns, preventing them from moving, you've trapped those pawns. We've seen this with one example, but traps can be set in a number of situations. That's where your creativity and analysis comes into play. In this next lesson, let's see what Black can do better to prevent itself from being trapped. There are many ways to do this. One of the simplest ways is to not place its pawns in a corner of the board. For example, they could place their tokens here. This way, Gold can surround and trap the Black pawns. The next strategy is a little more complicated than the first two because it requires a little bit of counting. But if you can count to 10, you should be able to understand this part. When playing Motif, it's important to be aware of how many squares on the board have your color versus how many squares have your opponent's color. Having more squares with your color and less squares with your opponent's color is better, since having more will allow you to win. This is why changing an opponent's square to yours on your turn is more advantageous than changing a white square that's on the board. Let's see how this applies with an example. In this situation, both Gold and Black have 6 squares. 3 of each of those squares are occupied by the respective pawns. So in this case, Gold could occupy 4 new additional white squares, 3 from the already existing pawns and a 4th from the new added pawn during this turn. At the end of this turn, Gold would have 10 squares to their name, while Black would have 6. Then it would be Black's turn, and if they did the same thing, occupy white squares, they would also have 10 squares with their color. Now, considering square counting tactic, what could Gold do instead that would improve their square count? Well, Gold could take Black squares instead of white squares. Gold would still end up with 10 squares at the end of their turn, but the difference is that now Black only has 3 squares, which means that on Black's next turn, they could only reach 7 squares with their color instead of 10. As such, being aware of square count and what move reduces the amount of squares from the other players is important to consider when strategizing in Motif. In this next lesson, we'll see a concept called protecting. Protecting happens when you impede the opposing player from being able to convert your existing squares to their color. In this example, it's Gold's turn. They have 3 squares to their name. By moving their pawns here, here, and here, they create a wall around their existing squares. As you can see, Black is now unable to change the Gold squares to Black. As such, Gold has protected their squares. One way to prevent a player from protecting squares is by neighboring those squares. Neighboring is when you place a pawn directly to one of the 4 sides of a square. So let's say we place a pawn here. This pawn would be neighboring these 4 squares. In this example, Black pawns are neighboring the following squares. When pawns neighbor a square, this guarantees the pawn will have access to these squares on the following turn if they remain unoccupied. Now let's see how this can be used to guarantee that Black has access to the Gold squares on Black's next turn. If instead of placing Black pawns here, they place them here, Gold would be unable to protect their already existing squares. So, we've seen how neighboring prevents players from protecting squares, but it is not only used for this purpose. We will not explain all the possibilities neighboring brings to your Motif game. It's up to you to have fun and discover those variants as you play with Motif. Now that we understand how traps work and how to protect squares, it's possible to understand how the game dynamic will change when a player plays their 5th or their 5th pawn. Having the 5th pawn in play is an important moment in the game because the board is made up of a 5x5 grid. With 5 pawns on the board, it is possible to split the board in half. On the bigger half, the player protects his squares, all while trapping the opponent's pawns on the other smaller half of the board. This ultimately leads to a win. So in this example, the gold player will be the first to play their fifth, and in this specific situation be able to get into a winning position. They will do this by placing their pawns as follows. As you can see, they now control more than half of the board's squares, all while trapping all of the opponent's pawns. To counter a fifth, it's simple. You must be mindful of when the fifth will come into play. What's important is to place pawns in a way that you have access to all areas no matter the configuration of the other player's pawns. So let's analyze two configurations that black has put themselves in and see if they counter the gold's fifth. In this first configuration, black has taken notice that gold's next turn will have their fifth in play. This player is wary that gold will create a horizontal split by placing their 5 pawns in this middle row. So black decides to place pawns on this top half of the board and this bottom half. But oh no, gold decides to create a vertical split with their 5 pawns, and now black has lost the game. Let's go back to the beginning of this turn and see what black could have done better. This time, black decided to protect himself from a vertical and a horizontal split from gold's fifth. So this time they will take the 4 quadrants of the board by placing their pawns here, 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 and here. This way, even if gold attempts to split the board like so, there is a limited effect to black's movement. And now, black still has the opportunity to stay in the game and potentially win it. In Motif, the last person to play has the advantage. Because of this, you want to strategically play the game to be the last to play. Let's take this example. It's late in the game, gold is clearly winning, but the last square before ending the game is free. If black changes the gold squares to black before capturing the last square and ending the game, they will have more black squares than gold and win the game. In this example, gold lost because they didn't play in a way to be the last to play, even though they had the upper hand throughout the game. We previously saw how important it was to play last. There are different ways to keep last movement control. Let's take a look at some now. The first way is simply to create a situation where there are at least 7 squares on the board. Why 7? Because each player only has 6 pawns. With 7 squares available, it makes it impossible to color the remaining squares on the turn. As in this example, if gold takes just one of the white squares, they may lose the game, because now black is able to fill the 6 remaining squares on their turn. The other way is to protect white squares from being converted by the opposing player's pawns. For example, it's black's turn. They can protect white squares by moving here. Now it's impossible for gold to end the game because gold can't access the following white squares. Now, black has the last move advantage since they will be able to change these 2 white squares on their next turn. There are many other ways to keep control of the last move. Once again, it's simply a matter of being creative with how you play Motif. That's it for now. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to some Motif tactics. Hopefully this video has been helpful. It took several days to put these tactics in a nice digestible format. It would be greatly appreciated if you hit that like button and the subscribe button to help out. If there's something that can be improved, or if you have any questions, please leave a comment and I'll be happy to reply. Thanks again and have an awesome day.